going to, for people who aren't able to be here tonight, we'll put it online. So just, word of warning that you need to be on your best behavior since we're recording all of this. We'll give people a couple of minutes to kind of get started as we're coming in. As we do that, I do have a handout for the evening. If anybody would like to hand out the handouts. Look, I think Tracy's going to come up to you so you guys can divide and conquer the two sides of the auditorium here. I think we've got enough, should have enough for everybody to do that. Yeah, she doesn't want to have to share with her dad. That's no good. No good at all. So what I thought we would do to get started, I know that a lot of us are familiar. So we're doing a deep dive tonight on the book of Ruth. That's the sermon series that we just kicked off on Sunday. We're going to spend 5 weeks working through this particular Old Testament text. So the goal tonight is just to spend more time kind of working with the text and digging into it and talking about some topics and themes and things that we can't get into as much on a Sunday morning just because of time and because Sunday morning is more one-way communication, but the nice thing about these deep dives is that they can be more of a conversation. So if there are questions you can ask, one person just had a very important theological question for me before it began, was whether or not he felt like Ruth was attractive or not. You think she was pretty? I'm like, well, judging by Boaz's response, I would say probably so. Of course, then if you dig a little farther into Boaz's response, he's just grateful that she picked him instead of a younger guy. So maybe, I don't know what that says. So, yeah, so most of us I know are probably familiar with the story of Ruth, but maybe have read it, maybe even read it recently, maybe read it today to get ready for this. But we also have had long days where we've been at work and we've been doing some other commitments and things during the day. So what I want us to do to get started is we're going to watch the video, the Bible Project. So the Bible Project is a nonprofit out of Portland that creates biblical study tools. And they created these animated videos on each book of the Bible. It gives you kind of an overview of it, so it tells a story. So the handout that I gave you has 2 sheets. The back side of that is the poster they have for the book of Ruth, and the video is neat because you kind of see the poster being drawn. So I think it does a good job of kind of walking us through the story and remembering that. So it's about 7 minutes long, so we're going to take a minute and we're going to watch that together. If you were watching with us online, I'm going to pause the recording and would encourage you to just Google YouTube, go to YouTube and Google Ruth Bible Project video and watch it because it doesn't really work well to stream the videos through Zoom. It doesn't record well. So we're going to pause the recording and we'll pick it back up after I forget. Okay, so hopefully that was at least a little bit of a reminder of what the book of Ruth is about and the story and all of that. So what I thought we would do to get started, and as we go through that, I really do want this to be as conversational as you want it to be. So if there are questions that you have that you want to know more about, feel free to stick your hand up. If we start going down a rabbit trail that seems like it's not very helpful, you can just be like, because I hope this is going to be a helpful time for you. So what I figured we would do is just start out by working through the handout. There's some extra ones of those up here if somebody didn't get one of those. But basically, so the information on this I got from, there's a really wonderful series of books by 2 guys, Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart. Fee is a New Testament scholar, Stewart's an Old Testament scholar. And they wrote a book called How to Read the Bible Book by Book. So it's nice because for every book of the Bible, it's got like a 5 or 6 page kind of introduction to it, kind of some information about it, a little overview, and pointers on reading specific sections. So some of these things, especially the bold print things, I took from that. Others I got from some other resources that I mentioned here. But really, the story of Ruth is a story of people who are being loyal to God, to Yahweh, the God of the people of Israel, during the period of Judges, which is a time when a lot of people were not being loyal to him. And Naomi's fortunes in that sort of, they say, kind of mirror the fortunes of the people of Israel. It also, at the very end, as it mentions, kind of serves as a, hey, let me tell you a little bit about the family tree of David, who you're going to meet in the next book. The author of the book of Ruth is unknown. It's not a book that, so this was written by so-and-so. There's no signed person to it, and we don't exactly know when the composition is either. Most people think that it was written probably quite a while after the actual historical events that it records. Because there's this little moment in chapter 4 when Boaz is doing the land negotiation with the other guy. It said, well, here, let's just but it talks about how they sort of formalize the agreement. So Boaz announces to the elders and all the people who've done this. So the elders say, "We are all witnesses." Oh yeah, there it is. So it says, the kinsman, this is verse 7 of chapter 4. Now it says, there's a little note kind of explaining what's going on. It says, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So it's a little bit different than how we sign business contracts today. But apparently, it's one of the arguments then is, okay, maybe this was written down sometime later because the author felt like they had to explain, why is this guy taking his shoe off and handing it to Boaz? Because we don't do this anymore, enough time has passed, that's gone by. Also, the author is not known. So the Talmud suggests that Samuel was the author. That's who they've attributed to there. If it is a much later version of the story, that seems unlikely because Samuel's story picks up basically historically right where Ruth takes off, but that's who it's been attributed to. There are a number of scholars that wonder if the book of Ruth wasn't perhaps written by a woman whose name we don't know. There's no proof of that necessarily. You can't prove that it actually happened or prove that it didn't. But it does show some signs of being written by a woman. That's definitely written with women's concerns in mind. So for example, when you look at people who make that argument, there really is much more about the perspective of the women in the story, the stigma that Naomi faces for not being able to have children who survive into adulthood. Interesting side note, you may not know this, it's a little trivial pursuit question for you. Ruth is the only book of the Bible where women talk more than men. So there are 55 verses in the book of Ruth that are dialogue, that are conversations in that. And of those, 33 of them, those verses of speech, are women speaking to each other. Another little note, at the very end, again, if you get to chapter 4, and Naomi's grandson is born. And the women of Bethlehem, they're so excited. They go on and they say this. They say, praise be to the Lord. This is the women to Naomi, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. And he says, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, gave you this grandson. So again, in that day and age, we're going to talk about this a little bit. It really is all about the sons that you have and how the lineage goes through them and the importance put on them. So the fact that, the author is kind of working in, oh yeah, by the way, she's actually worth more to you than 7 of those sons. What good are they anyway? So those are different, and if you think about it, it really is a story about the resilience of women when they're working together in solidarity. They are underneath this sort of culture where, as we'll talk about, men have the authority positions, property passes through them, but they still find ways to use those structures to their advantage and as they seek to survive. So those are some of the reasons that people sometimes look at this text and think, oh, maybe a woman wrote this down. There's no way to prove that, yes or no, but it's interesting. Whether or not you buy into that, Ruth's story is, everybody agrees that Ruth's story is 100% unique among ancient literature in the way that it talks about and celebrates female friendships and relationships between these two women. There's just really not any other piece of ancient writing that does that in the same way that Ruth does. So that's a little bit about the author and the composition. The time period it talks about is really, the first verse of Ruth says that all this took place during the time of the judges. So there are different views on when that was. It really depends on when you date the Exodus. Some people date the Exodus around 1400 BC. Other people, because of kind of Egyptian records, dated around 1220 BC. But it ends around 1050 BC when Saul comes onto the scene. So anyway, that's somewhere, I'm guessing it's somewhere around 1200 years BC is when the events of this story are taking place. And the last verse of the book of Judges sums it up pretty well, right? The book of Ruth starts saying, in the days when the judges ruled, starts the story. And if you go back one verse to the last verse of Judges, it says, in those days, Israel had no king and everybody did as they saw fit. And that's a pretty apt description of what was going on at the end of the time of Judges. It was really dark, very violent, very chaotic time in the life of Israel. It's interesting though, like globally, it wasn't just Israel that was having a dark, chaotic time then. Most of the ancient Near East was kind of in turmoil at the same time. The Egyptian, the Hittite, the Mesopotamian empires, they were all in decline. The Greeks were undergoing all sorts of political upheaval. This is the time when the Sea Peoples and the Philistines, or some of their descendants, they were beginning to sort of attack and really kind of lay waste to the Mediterranean basin. So it's a very chaotic time for the people of Israel. But it's also a pretty chaotic time for a lot of other things that are going on in history at that time. But then in the midst of all of that darkness and chaos, yeah, Doug.
So, my understanding of when kings came in, they did that because other nations had kings. So God was displeased with them because they would no longer follow him.
Yeah. So the point you're making is that at the end of the time of Judges, the people of Israel asked for a king because the neighboring nations had those. And God was displeased by that because he wanted to be their king. Yeah, and I think God kind of accedes to their request because over the time of the period of Judges when they had no king, things were just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. It's kind of like, this is not my ideal, but it's probably better than some of the things that you guys are doing now. But yeah, so especially a lot of the small nations. So because these giant superpowers of the day were struggling, that gave some space for these little kingdoms to pop up, like the king of Moab, things like that. And then the neighbors had kings, exactly. So again, all this is kind of going on the global political scene. And then in the midst of that, you have this really beautiful little story about life in a village that probably had 200, 300, 400 people in it. So Bethlehem was not a huge city at that time. And it's just about people trying to be loyal to God and faithful to God during this time of the Judges. And it's the story of how God really creates a space for this Moabite woman, this foreign woman, and brings her into the family, and then ultimately uses that to provide Israel with its first and greatest king. Little note, this is something that I think is interesting. It shows up sometimes in the footnotes of the stories you're reading through it, but just the names of the original family as you're reading through this story. So you've got Naomi, kind of one of the main characters, and her name in Hebrew means pleasant or lovely or delightful. And she makes a play on words on that at the end of the first chapter. After she loses her family and comes back, the people in her hometown see her and they're like, this can't be Naomi. And she's like, don't call me Naomi, right? There's nothing pleasant about my life anymore. You should call me Mara, which means bitter or bitterness, because the Lord has made my life bitter. So she makes a little play on words with her name. But also, her husband's name, Elimelech, means my God is king. And then the two sons who really only show up to get married and then die, their names mean sickly and wasting away. So that's kind of the name sort of tell you the role they're going to play in the story. They're there and they kind of just get wasted away. And for you, as you read through the book of Ruth on your own, I would encourage you to do that over this month as we're working through it in our sermons together. You can really explore it on a number of different levels. And I try to list some of that out on this handout. And, you might want to read through it multiple times and pick one of these lenses and say, how do I see this happening as I read through it this time? It's the story of God at work, his providence just in the lives of ordinary people as they're doing their ordinary things. That's what we were talking about in the sermon this past Sunday. It is also an illustration of the way that God works with people who pray and makes things happen. Most of the prayers that are prayed by the characters in this book are actually then fulfilled by other people, other human beings, as God inspires and works through them. It's an example of people who do these acts of loving kindness. There's a Hebrew word, hesed, which means loving kindness or sort of steadfast love of God. And it's a word that oftentimes in the Bible is used to describe the character of God himself. In Exodus, when God introduces himself to Moses, like that's how he says, the Lord, compassionate, slow to anger. Like he uses that word to describe himself. But that word is also used to describe Ruth and the way that she and Orpah have loved Naomi. It's a word that's used to describe Boaz. Boaz describes Ruth with it, and Ruth describes Boaz. So it's not just a word that describes the character of God, but it also shows the way that those of us who follow God reflect his character and try to live like him and embody those same characteristics in the relationships that we have with each other. So it's interesting to read through the story with that lens. You can read it as a story about women, as we were talking about. You can read it as an example of God including outsiders into the family, particularly an outsider, a Gentile. Ruth is not Jewish, right? She's a Moabite, but she puts her trust and faith in God and kind of, puts her commitment to him. And even though the Moabites were forbidden, like people of Israel were forbidden from allowing the Moabites to join the family of God, God makes an exception for Ruth. And what does that mean? And there's all sorts of interesting things to think about there. And then obviously you can read it just as part of the larger story of the Bible as a whole, because that footnote at the end says, oh yeah, by the way, Ruth and Boaz, they had this son who had a son who had a son who was David the king. And David obviously is in the line of Jesus. And Ruth shows up again in the Bible in the New Testament, in the first chapter of Matthew, when he's giving his kind of the family tree of Jesus. So all those are different lenses that you can look at as you read through this story. It's actually a really good time of year to be reading this story. Ruth is one of, in the Hebrew Bible, and I may be getting this wrong, it's in a collection of 5 books that are together. They call the 5 scrolls. And those different books are read out loud, often during different annual festivals that the Jewish people have. So Esther, we talked about Esther this past year. Esther is read during the Feast of Purim. Ruth is often read during the Feast of Shavuot, which actually takes place about a week from today is when that's going to happen this year. And that's a festival where the people of Israel celebrated the gift of the Torah to God's people. That's part of what they recognize on that. It's also the day that's traditionally associated with the death of David. So that's part of why they choose to read the story of Ruth during this festival, because it kind of tells the story of David and where he came from. Some of you guys were here on Sunday told us this has absolutely nothing to do really with anything in the book of Ruth, but I think it's an interesting anecdote. This is where Oprah Winfrey gets her name. So Oprah Winfrey, the TV personality, her legal name is Orpah. So the 2 daughters-in-law of Naomi are Ruth and Orpah. So the name on her birth certificate is Orpah Winfrey. But her family had a very difficult time saying the word Orpah, and they started pronouncing it Oprah. So she just went with that. So that's how, millions of people around the world know her today as Oprah Winfrey. But legally, her name is Orpah Winfrey. So again, just keep that in mind for Trivial Pursuit. You never know when that's going to come up and be helpful. Any thoughts, questions, anything about that so far? Yeah, Lillian.
Children such dismal.
Yeah, why would you name your child Orpah? Yeah, yeah, why would you name your son Sickly or Wasting Away? Maybe it just had a ring to it. It sounded good with their last name. Who knows? No, and they're interesting biblical names. I remember I had a friend in high school, Debbie, who didn't go to church, but she went to this summer camp, and she came back. She's like, hey, I met this guy who said he had a biblical name. His name is Dathan. And I'm like, that's not in the Bible. She's like, that's what he said. I was like, well, I go to church. I should know. So I went back, and my dad had a concordance. So I looked up Dathan, and Dathan is one of the guys who rebel against Moses in the wilderness time. And literally the earth opens up and swallows him up and his family. And I just remember thinking, it's one thing to name your kid Sickness, or something what are you doing? It seems like a very strange thing. I'm going to name my kid. It'd be like naming your kid Ahab, or naming your daughter Jezebel or something like that. It's is that really the vibe you're going for? But anyway, that's Dathan. Yes, they were born before they moved, because, well, could be. Oh, okay. Different character. Yep, so they had the sons while they were in Israel, because verse 3 says, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Wait, oh no, they were Ephrathites, and they went to Moab and lived there, so the 4 of them left. So yeah, right, yeah, they left because there was a famine in Israel, and there's food in Moab. So if you look, yeah, Mitch.
I read somewhere that the Moabites are not welcome into Jewish, because they help them from the Jewish people from escaping.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of the 10 generations. Yeah, there's a complicated history with Israel and Moab. So some of it is that, if you go back to the book of Judges, the king of Moab is one of the people who invades the nation, and at least puts part of the nation kind of under slavery for about 18 years until Gideon or Samson, one of them, kind of leads some people up against that. The Moabites also worshipped a god Chemosh or Chemosh. They would offer human sacrifices to them. So for all of these reasons, especially in the Old Testament period, it has very stringent laws about intermarrying with people of other faiths, because of the way that their faith can influence the faith life of the people of Israel and pull them away from his teachings. So yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit this Sunday coming up, like the fact that Elimelech leaves, like, okay, his name is, my God is the king, my God is the one who rules, he's the one who provides. Like, well, why are you leaving Israel? Okay, well, but maybe, maybe he's looking for food, but all the places to go, like, you really want to go to Moab? I mean, it's an interesting turn of events for a number of reasons. But really, so if you look back at that, at the very bottom of that orienting sheet, that line, the book of Ruth tells the story of God's faithfulness to his people in a specific case as a Moabite woman becomes part of his story of redemption. So that's how Fee and Stewart kind of summarize the story. And that idea of redemption is a really key term all throughout the Bible. But it's one of those Bible words that one of the professors at my seminary, a lady named Sandy Richter, said became a Bible-ish word. So it's from the Bible and it's in English, so it's Bible-ish, but it's so overused in Christian community that it starts to lose its meaning. It's like one of those Christianese words that people kind of throw out and you're not exactly sure, what does that actually mean anyway? Because the church uses it, right? The church got the word redemption from the New Testament. So for example, in Luke 1, it says, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. He has visited us and accomplished redemption for his people. Peter writes in 1 Peter, you know that you are not redeemed with perishable things. So they are using this word. And they get it from the Old Testament, right? So for example, the Old Testament author Isaiah says, but now thus says the Lord your creator, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. So this is a word that the church used, it was used in the New Testament, it was used in the Old Testament. But the interesting thing is this was not like in the Old Testament, this was not like a theological word. Like for us, we have, a theology of redemption. And what does that mean? It was just a word that was used in the culture at that time. And it's a word that is really rich in meaning. So it's worth our time to dig into this word and understand, okay, how is this word used in the time of Ruth? And Ruth is a really good vehicle for doing that because it uses that word so often, right? It talks about you're our kinsman redeemer and Boaz redeems her. So it shows up, it's a good test case to look at how the word is used. But to really, I think, understand the richness of that word and what it means for us today, we need to look at the way that it was used in the culture at that time. And we have to remember that that is an ancient tribal culture 3 years ago. So it's very different from ours. A lot of the values are different. But understanding how it was used then gives us some real riches now. Because again, at that time, the word to redeem, the Hebrew word ga'al, it didn't have anything to do with theology. It had everything to do with the laws and the social customs of this ancient tribal society that the Hebrew people were a part of. So we want to learn how to apply today, we can do that. And what follows, I'm not, so I mentioned Sandy Richter, who was a professor. She has a fantastic book. It's called The Epic of Eden. It's called A Christian Entry into the Old Testament. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. I put it on that handout, her name, the title of the book. It is a wonderful overview of the Old Testament as a whole to help people understand how does it fit together, where do the major pieces and the players fit into it, how does that fit into the story of the Bible as a whole. She's a really, really gifted writer. She's funny, she's engaging. She also does a lot of work with archaeology. So when Martha and I were in Israel last summer, we went and visited a site where one of the guys in our group 10 years before that had been on an archaeological dig with Dr. Richter there. So she draws a lot on those resources. So it is really worth your time to read this book. I can't recommend it highly enough. And it's just a little teaser of what you will get. Pretty much everything that follows, I am just going to read to you parts of her book, things that I highlighted. Like these are her ideas that were helpful to me, and I feel like they can be helpful to you all as well. So I'm just reading or summarizing her excellent work from here on out. So if we want to try to figure, okay, what did this word mean back in that tribal culture? We have to remember that in the culture at that time, the family unit literally was the center of everything. So as an individual, like you're linked to the legal, the economic structures of the day, it's all through the family. And Israel's tribal culture was a patriarchal culture. So there's the patriarch, like the kind of the oldest guy who's in charge of the clan. And the patriarch was responsible for the economic well-being of the entire family unit. He enforced the laws. He had the responsibility to care for people in his family who became marginalized through poverty or death or war. So really, if you were meeting somebody, the most important things that you want to know about them to try to figure out where they fit is, who is your dad? what gender are you? Are you a guy or a girl? And what birth order are you? Because there's a lot of value in being the firstborn son in this patriarchal culture. We'll talk about that. And again, it's very different than in our world today, right? We've got bureaucracies to enforce laws, and our value in society is not, like I'm the youngest in my family. So does that mean I'm out? I have an older sister, so technically I'm the firstborn son. So we're all good. I can still soar. But so in Israel's tribal culture, the family was central. And there's three terms that describe how those families worked that are really important for figuring out what's going on with this idea of redemption in Ruth. So their society was patriarchal, it was patrilineal, and then it was also patrilocal. So I'll explain all those as we go through. So patriarchy, or the patriarchal, has to do with the centrality of the oldest living male member of the family, right? So the oldest living male member of the family, they're in charge of things. So everybody else's place in society is through their relationship to this person. And in the patriarchal society, for example, when a man married, he stayed in the household that he was a part of. But when a daughter married, she left the household and became part of this other part of the clan, right? So in fact, actually the word for family in Hebrew, the terminology for family in ancient Israel is this word, it's called the Bet Ab, which means the house of the father. So that's kind of the basic family unit there. So people lived in what we in Western culture would talk about an extended family unit. So there's the patriarch, his wife, unwed kids, married sons and their wives and their kids. That's all part of the family. So again, when the son marries, his wife becomes part of your family. When the daughter marries, she's gone, right? She's out of your family. She's in the other family. You see that, for example, in the Old Testament story with Isaac and Rebekah. So Isaac needs a wife. A guy journeys to find Rebekah. He kind of barters with Rebekah's dad, and she says, yeah, we'll do it. She leaves her family, right, and travels, gets on the camel and travels with him and becomes part of that family. So a lot of the archaeological studies that look at this, they think sort of the typical kind of family unit in Israel would have had maybe up to 3 generations, 30 people, something like that. And this extended family, like they were in it together as far as sharing resources and sharing a common fate. So then what happens if you find yourself in that society and you are outside of a family, like you're not part of anybody's behalf? So you're a widow, for example, right? Because you would, as a widow, when you go, you leave your father's family and you go be a part of this family. Well, then what's left? What happens to you when your husband dies? Like you can be kind of left in this no man's land. Who's going to take care of you? An orphan, right? If you don't have a dad, you're not connected to this family. Who takes care of you then? And that's one of the reasons why when you read through the Old Testament, there are so many laws that talk about how God wants us to make provisions and to care for the orphan and the widow and also the foreigner in our midst, because those are the people who aren't connected to this larger family unit that has a responsibility for them to care for them. So because of that, right, the patriarch has the legal and the economic responsibility for the household. So in very extreme situations, the patriarch would decide whether or not people in their family would live or die. So an example of that in the Bible, if you know the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. So Judah has 3 sons. Tamar marries one of them, he dies. She marries the second one, he dies. Well, he's supposed to give the third one to her, but at this point, he's like, I don't know what's going on with Tamar. So he's like, well, just wait a while, and when he gets older, we'll give it to you. Well, she waits, and it's very clear that he has no intention of doing that. So she tricks Judah, and she disguises herself, tricks Judah into sleeping with her, and she gets pregnant. Well, you can't keep that secret for long. And eventually, the rest of the people in the clan realize Tamar is pregnant. So they bring her to Judah as the patriarch to say, what do we do? Do we let her live, or do we put her to death? They bring her to her. The term they use is to administer justice. So he says, bring her out and let her be burned, right? Because as the head of the household, his words carry the power of life and death for this woman. Now, we'll come back to that story in just a minute. So that's the role of the patriarch. So when the patriarch dies, or when the family unit grows to the point where it's just too big to be manageable, that household would split into 2 households, each of which is headed by the now oldest living man in that family. So again, there's an example that you think about the beginning of Genesis when Abraham leaves to come into the promised land, right? So Terah, his dad, goes with him. Abraham is there. Abraham's brother is there, Haran, and then Lot, his son, are there, right? So they go together. Haran dies, so Lot is still connected with his family because Abraham's looking out for him. And then Terah dies. And then eventually it gets to the point where things have grown so much that they just can't be together anymore. So in Genesis 13, Lot and Abraham, they says that the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great, they were not able to remain together. So Abraham at that point invites Lot to be separated from upon me. So he chooses this place, Abraham chooses this place, and the one family unit at this point kind of splits out into the two family units. So that's the whole, the patriarchal culture, the way the family worked in that. So that was one of those three words, right? Patriarchal, patrilineal, patrilocal. So patrilineal is the idea that you trace your ancestry through the male line. So in Israel, the possession of your land, like it passed from father to firstborn son. And so there was an idea that like you in God early on when he because the way the law is set up, God actually owns all of the land, but he kind of gives it to the tribes for a while, and he wants it to stay with the tribe. So it's going to pass from father to son, father to son. So there's a lot of laws that are built up about how you don't want the family name to go out. And again, like the resources that go with the land pass on to the next oldest son because they're going to be the new patriarch. They need to have the resources to fulfill their duties, to care for other people and all of that. So there are these legal structures. So for example, if you read the genealogies in the Old Testament, this is why women are never named, right? Because it's all about the land passing from father to son. So when women are named, it's because the author is trying to highlight something unusual that's going on. So we'll look at that in Matthew 1 in a little bit. But most often, if a woman's name, it's because they're trying to make a point that something unusual is happening there. And again, the genealogies also give you a real position, a window into the privileged position of being the firstborn son. So the firstborn son, when it came to their inheritance, got twice as much as everybody else. Now, how would that work in our world? Like, can you imagine Christmas morning? So, we have one son, 3 daughters. So can you imagine they come down and like our son Simon's stocking is twice as full as the girls. And he's got twice as many presents as the girls. How's that going to go over? Yeah, did you say good for him? Yeah, not well. That's not going to go well. And again, in our society, we just think that's just crazy. But there was a reason for that in this tribal society, right? Because the firstborn got this double portion because they're the next patriarch. Sooner or later, they're going to have this family unit to care for. And as we're going to see, there's some real expenses and commitments that went along with that. So they wanted to make sure that they had the resources that they would need to be able to make sure that the family unit survives so that the land can stay in the family, it can keep passing down. And, it's interesting too. So there are also, but again, if you look at the Bible, there's also a lot of examples where God doesn't work that way, right? Where he works through the second born, or David, this king, David's like the 7th or 8th son, right? So God subverts that order times at 2, which is interesting. Yeah, so again, I think I mentioned is in a patrilineal society, children always belong to their father's tribe. So when a daughter came of age, she gets married and she becomes part of somebody else's family. So if you think about it, this is why it was really critical for a woman to marry and then to have kids. Because your life as a woman in the ancient Near East, first you're your father's daughter, then you're your husband's wife, then you're your son's mom, right? So you're father's daughter until you get married. And then hopefully you have some sons, because when your husband dies and you're a widow, you're not a widow, like you're the mother of those sons. Like your place in society is dictated by the relationship that you have to the men in your life, your father, your husband, and then your sons. So a woman who didn't have a father or a husband or a son was destitute, like without help and charity from strangers, she was going to survive. So that's why there's all these laws on the book. And we'll talk about this as we go through the book of Ruth too, that say like when you're gleaning the field, when you're harvesting, you know, inevitably when you're harvesting, you drop some. And the law is, well, you can't go back and pick it up. You've got to leave that on the ground. So it says, whenever you gather, don't go over it again. It will be for the alien, for the orphan, and the widow. So there are these laws that are put in place to care for the people who are falling through the cracks of society. So another law then that's concerned with the well-being of widows is directed to making sure that the inheritance of the land keeps going. So it's this idea about levirate marriage, if you're familiar with that in Deuteronomy 25. Basically, it says, okay, if the family unit, if there's more than one son, if one of those sons is married and dies but doesn't have any kids, it is his brother's responsibility to father a child with his sister-in-law. That child, while biologically is his, is legally going to be the son of the deceased brother, so that the name of the brother doesn't disappear, so that the land can continue to pass down through the generations through that son. So the intent of that law is to protect the young widow from destitution, because now she's going to have a son who's going to have land, who's going to have resources, so she has a way to provide for herself. And it's also to make sure that her deceased husband's inheritance keeps going. Again, I continue to think this would have made family reunions just incredibly bizarre. But again, for us, this is the people in Israel considered a really serious offense for a man not to live up to this responsibility. So in that passage in Deuteronomy 25 that talks about the law, there's a long section that talks about what does the woman do if her brother-in-law doesn't want to fulfill his duty, and she can kind of file this formal complaint about him. And this is just so great. Again, different culture, different time. So the elders summon whom, they speak to him, they say, you got to do this. If he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal off of his foot. Ooh, that's getting him. And then she spits in his face and she declares, thus it is done to the man who does not build up the house of his brother. In Israel, his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed, which to us is like, but that was some kind of sick burn back then. You know, that was really, again, just in an honor and shame society. Those are the cardinal values. You're being shamed because you're not doing your responsibility to work within the system that's patriarchal and patrilineal, right? It needs to continue to pass down. And again, this system seems really weird to us as 21st century Westerners, but for the most part, it worked, right? It kept the land, it kept the land going, it kept people's names established. And when you think about that, sort of, it's a patriarchal culture, it's a patrilineal culture. It makes sense that if you go back to that story of Judah and Tamar that we talked about, and you see a little bit more about what's going on. So again, that story is found in Genesis 38 if you want to look at it at some point. But so Tamar, when she gets married to Judah's oldest son, she becomes part of his bet-at, right? Part of his family. And as such, Judah has a responsibility for bringing her to justice when the townspeople are like, hey, she's pregnant, she's not married, right? So he brings it up, and in agreement with the norms of the society, Judah says, okay, she should be killed. But there are more details that are going on, right? Because we know the backstory. So she actually married Judah's firstborn, a guy named and he died. So again, think about that levirate marriage law. He's got two other brothers. So the responsibility within the family is for the second brother, Onan, to have a child with Tamar so that Judah's son, the firstborn son, his name can continue on. There'll be the double inheritance for the firstborn, all of that. So that's what he's supposed to do. But Onan doesn't do it. We have some kids in the room, so we won't talk about the details of it, but he finds a way to get around getting her pregnant. And God kills him for it. So now there's a third son, right? So technically, Judah should give the third son to Tamar, but at this point, he's afraid there's something wrong with this woman. I mean, really, he needs to think, what's wrong with my sons? I mean, that's why one of the sons is dead. It wasn't her fault. And he thinks, okay, if the third son dies, well, maybe something will happen to him too. So that's when he says, well, when he gets older, you guys can get married. But the biblical narrator makes it really clear he's got no intention of ever doing that. So eventually, after a long time, she takes matters into her own hands. Judah gets her pregnant, but she kind of tricks him into leaving like a token, like a little seal that he has with him to identify him. So when she gets pregnant, as she knew was going to happen, she gets dragged in front of him, and he's like, we need to take her out and burn her. She's like, oh, by the way, the guy who got me pregnant is the owner of this. And she pulls out this thing that identifies Judah. So it says, listen to what it says here. It says, it was while she was being brought out to be burned that she sent to her father-in-law, Judah, saying, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. It says, look whose signet ring and cord and staff these are. And Judah recognizes that they're his, and he thinks about what he has done. And this is what he says. She is more righteous than I. Okay, she is more righteous than I. So the woman who just tricked her father-in-law into having sex with him is more righteous than the father-in-law. Like, how could Judah, like one of the patriarchs, how could he make that statement? It's because he did not fulfill his duties as the patriarch of that clan. And he's going against the cultural values of patrilineal, of keeping it in. So in our world, like what Tamar did is pretty morally reprehensible. But in her culture, it was Judah who was on the wrong end of things. He had failed to honor this levirate law, and he had allowed another household to take responsibility for his widowed daughter-in-law, right? She's having to go somewhere else to figure out how to stay alive because he's basically cut her off. So that's when you understand the culture of the day, that whole weird story starts to make a little bit more sense. And again, there's one other law that shows up in Ruth that has to do with making sure that land stayed in the family, that people's name didn't go out from earth. So again, most of the people in Israel at this time, they lived on small family farms, and the goal of that economy was just to keep the family alive. So in a society like that, keeping your land is really important. If you don't have your land, you don't have a way to provide for yourself. So there would be occasions where people got sick, or they couldn't work, or they were poor, they needed the money, so they would sell the land. And again, so it's interesting. The parcels of land originally distributed by God were to pass from father to son in perpetuity. So no sale you make to another person is ever permanent in Israel. It stays in the family. So really what would happen is, again, the responsibility of the patriarch is if somebody in his extended family is in such dire straits they have to sell the land, it's the patriarch's responsibility to buy it back, to redeem it so that it stays in the family. And then if there's nobody who can redeem it, then eventually at the year of Jubilee, which happened every 50 years, it would kind of revert back to the family. And again, there's not a lot of evidence or examples of whether or not this practice was widespread or not, but just the fact that the laws are there, it just shows you the value of this. So, and again, this is strange for us, but this is just how things worked back then. So it's patriarchal. You got the one guy in charge and his responsibilities to care and all that. It's patrilineal in that, that it passes from father to son, the land stays together. And then it's patrilocal. And this is one that I didn't actually know much about until I went to seminary, but it has to do with the actual living space of the family unit, which, as we would come to respect, is built around the patriarch, around the oldest male. So typically, like, families would kind of live in a compound together surrounded by a wall. Or if, the patriarch had a house and the son was old enough to get married, he would build an addition onto the house and would do that so that when he got married, he was able to actually bring his wife in and put that place there. And again, it helps you see that, like, just the way that worked, the goal in this tribal culture is that the tribe intended to live together. It's when they can stay together as a family that they have the capacity to work and to prosper and to protect themselves and defend themselves and all of that. This also makes sense of something that Jesus says. So if you think about it, like, you go back to John 14. So Jesus is nearing the end of the life. It's part of the farewell discourses. And he tells, the disciples, he's like, I'm getting ready to go. And Peter's like, where are you going? Can we go with you? And this is what Jesus responds. So at the beginning of chapter 14, he says, do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. Like, sometimes in the King James Version, it's many mansions. If it were not so, I would not have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come again to receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may also be. Right? In my Father's house, there are many places for people to dwell. Like, we have this idea of, heaven, and like, we all have our mansion up on the hill. And that's not what he's talking about. Jesus is saying to the disciples is that the ultimate destination that we have as adopted children of God is to be a part of the family compound, right? He's saying, I'm preparing a place for you so that you can come and you can be with the Father, the patriarch, right? You can live with him. It's about being reconnected with the God that we have together. Like, that's what Jesus is getting at with the whole in my Father's house, there are many rooms kind of thing. So patrilocal, right? You get married, you're living together, and that goal is to be together as a family. So all these things together, like, what does any of that have to do with the book of Ruth and understanding redemption and how it plays out in here? So just walk through the story of Ruth and Boaz together with this idea. This is the culture they lived in. This is the society that they lived in. So during the era of the Judges, this Israelite woman, Naomi, she marries this guy from Bethlehem, Elimelech. She's got 2 sons. So in that world, she's blessed, right? Because she's not just a husband of one. She's got 2 sons. I mean, she's really doing well because her value is in the men she's connected to. So local famine, they end up to leave. So they leave their land, right? They leave the land that is theirs and they go to Moab, where Elimelech dies. So Naomi's a widow. So this is horrible, but she still has 2 sons. It's not as disastrous as it could be. So the sons take Moabite wives and then they die. And then again, where does that leave Naomi? Her husband's dead. Her 2 adult sons are dead. And there's no grandkids in the future, right? There's no hope for that family line to continue. And she's not home anymore. She's not even near her extended family that she left. I mean, she's all on her own. So she really chooses the only course of action that's left her. She's like, well, let's go back to Bethlehem. And maybe somebody will look out for me there. There are these laws where I can glean there. So the girls, Orpah and Ruth, the daughters-in-law, they want to come with her. And Naomi basically begs them to stay. She's like, there's nothing for you. And again, think about what she says in terms of this sort of the levirate marriage and all of that, right? She's like, I'm too old to have a husband. And if I did have a husband, even if I had a husband tonight and bore sons, would you wait until they would grow? Like, would you really wait until the as yet unborn brother of your son gets old enough to get you pregnant so that you can have a son who legally is the son of you? Like, are you really going to stick around long enough to wait for that? Like, there's no hope in the system that we have of this happening for you. So you understand that what Naomi is referring to. So Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, she listens to what Naomi says. She goes home because she can maybe get married again. She's young enough that she can have kids. But Ruth decides to stick with her. So that's when she says that line, don't urge me to leave back. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I'll lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. There I'll be buried. I'll probably tell a story on Sunday, but there's an old song that was based off the song of Ruth. It's called "Whither Thou Goest, I Will Go." And my parents actually had that sung at their wedding. And I think that is a decision my mom has regretted to this day, because our family moved a lot. My parents actually just a week ago moved out here to Dallas. And I think over the course of their marriage, we were counting up, they've lived in like 16 or 17 different houses in 3 different countries and 7 different US states. So I don't know that mom knew exactly what she was signing up for with the "Whither Thou Goest" thing. And actually, I was telling that story to Martha's dad, and I think they had that song played as like the recessional at their wedding. And your parents lived in like 25 different houses or something in 3 different countries and a handful of states too. So just be careful what you wish for, I guess, when you pick your wedding music, right? We didn't sing that at our wedding, no. But really, like, and again, that song gets quoted in weddings, and it's good for that, right? Because it's this commitment, I'm casting my lot with you, we're together. But really, these words are just a very straightforward assertion of tribal solidarity, right? Like my affiliation, Naomi, is now with you. I had this patrilineal society that I was, but like, I'm turning my back on that. I am choosing you as my kin. I am choosing your God as my God, and I'm not leaving, right? So Ruth leaves, they go back to Bethlehem. They take advantage of those gleaning laws so that they can start getting things. And it's interesting because, the author of Ruth is just slips like the very first verse of chapter 2. It's like, oh, by the way, there's this guy, Boaz, he's a close relative, just plant that. Because then a couple of verses later, you meet Boaz and you're primed as a reader to be like, oh, he's a close relative. I wonder how this is going to play into all of this. So he ends up, seeing Ruth. He hears what she's done to care for her, care for Naomi, and tells his workers to be nice to her, says you can keep coming here. So she goes back that night and she's gained all of this stuff, and she's like, hey, look at all this food I got. She's like, wow, where'd you go? Oh, this field, this guy named Boaz. And Naomi kind of lights up. She's like, oh, he's a close relative. He is our kinsman redeemer. So really, like, Boaz is the patriarch of this clan that Ruth is a part of. Somehow there's this connection there. And because of the role that he has a responsibility to the people who were a part of his family. I assume that Elimelech was somehow, his son or son-in-law. There's some connection there, and Naomi is married into that family. So Boaz now has a responsibility to her. So she's starting to see, well, maybe there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, because there's these laws on the books and there's this guy here. So Ruth goes and basically says, hey, will you redeem us and will you marry me? He says, yeah, but there's this other guy, and he's a little bit closer in line, so he's got first dibs, but he says, no, I'm in it. So the next day he goes to the gate of the city. Again, most cities at that time had a wall around them for protection with one gate. The fields were outside of the city. The well was usually outside the city. So all day people are going in and out of the gate. So if you want to catch one of your neighbors, you just hang out at the gate long enough and they'll come by. And that's oftentimes where business transactions took place. So Boaz sees the other guy coming in. He's like, hey, by the way, Ruth is back. She's going to sell Elimelech's land because she's poor as dirt. And he's like, oh, well, I'll redeem it. But then he mentions to him, he's like, oh, by the way, when you do that, you also get Ruth, and you have to father a son with her who's going to inherit the land that you're spending your money on. And the guy starts doing the math in his head. And again, he's got his own commitments down the little family tree to people in his clan, right? And he starts seeing his savings account go down and down and down as he has to redeem this land. And he's not sure there's going to be enough left to give on to his kids. So he passes. And then obviously Boaz jumps on it. He's excited about it. They do something with their sandals, and it's good to go. But one of the things that you notice there's a real cost to the patriarch in redeeming somebody. Like he's giving up his money, that's his, inheritance for his kids, to redeem this land that's not going to stay in his part of the family, right? It's to make sure that this dead relative's name stays with the land. Like, so there's a real cost to them in doing that. So a couple of other stories, so that's kind of how this idea of redemption shows up in the book of Ruth. It has to do with the patriarch's role and the society and keeping the land, and the real cost that's involved in redeeming this land when people have gotten to the place where they've been lost to the family, right? They've been lost to the kinship circle because of their life circumstances. Another real quick example of how that word redemption shows up in the Old Testament, we talked about Abraham and Lot. So there's a story where they separate, and then Lot, these kind of foreign armies come in, they attack, they haul Lot and his family off. And Abraham, realizes this guy who's kind of part of his extended family, like he's in slavery. So he gathers up his own people, his own servants and slaves, and at a cost to himself goes and fights and gets them out, because a patriarch had responsibilities, right? If a member of their family was in need of ransom or rescue, like Lot was, the patriarch's expected to do something about that. So Abraham puts his own resources, his own household on the line, his own life on the line, to go and rescue his brother's son from this enemy that he had no defense against. So that's another expression of redemption. Third one, if you think about it, if you know the story of Hosea and Gomer. So Hosea was one of the prophets in the Old Testament, and it's sort of an illustration of the people of Israel. God basically, Homer's wife is unfaithful to him. He leaves, she starts working as a prostitute. He says, go take her back. He does, things are good for a little while. She leaves again, and things are so bad that she's apparently selling herself into slavery. And God says, you need to go and buy her back. Like, so Hosea finds himself in the public square, like all of his neighbors are around, and he's bidding, to try to buy back the mother of his children, his wife. That's what redemption is, right? It's buying this person back. So this is how Sandy Richter sums all this up. So she says, in Israel's tribal society, redemption was the act of a patriarch who put his own resources on the line to ransom a family member who'd been driven to the margins of society by poverty, or who'd been seized by an enemy against whom he had no defense, or who found themselves enslaved by the consequences of a faithless life. Redemption was the means by which a lost family member was restored to a place of security within the family. This was the patriarch's society. And then she says, can't you see how that plays out all throughout Scripture? God presents himself as the patriarch of the clan who has announced his intention to redeem his lost family members. And not only has he agreed to pay whatever ransom is required, he sends the most cherished member of his household, right, his firstborn son, to do that. And the firstborn doesn't just come to seek and save the lost, he's coming to share the inheritance with everybody, with people who've squandered what they've been given. His goal is to bring them back. I go to prepare a place for you so that you can be with me. And she says, that's why in the Christian church, we talk about each other as brother or sister, why we know God as Father, why we call ourselves the household of faith, because redemption is about coming back into the family. God is buying back his lost children by sending his eldest son, his heir, into the world to give his life as a ransom for many and to redeem us so that we can be adopted into his family. And that's why I think, and again, I remember I think it was in seminary, right out of seminary, I read this book. And it was one of those things where it's like, oh man, I've heard that word redemption like my whole life in the church, and just thought about it in terms of like the theology books that I've read. But when you go back and you see like, how is that word? Because like God speaks to us in a language that we can understand. He comes into our world. He speaks into real people's lives in real places at real times. And he uses the words, the concepts that they have in that culture. He doesn't always endorse them like they're all right, but he speaks in a language they can understand. So this idea of redemption that was there in the culture, God says like, oh, there's something about that idea that is what I want to do for my people. Like, and then when I started realizing that, like it's the language in the New Testament about redemption, it just comes to life in a new way. So that's why I was like, I could try to say that in 20 minutes, or I could just basically read what Sandy Richter said, because she says it a lot better than I do anyway. So thoughts about that? Comments, questions, ideas? Yeah, Martha. Right, right. And so I don't fully know the answer to that. It seems like, oh, it should be listed as Malon. I think because people know the story and the fact that they mentioned Ruth, because again, so if you could, we'll flip to Matthew chapter 1, for example, if you look at that. So Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus, you get down in verse 5, it says Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of King David. So I mentioned that in the genealogies only include men, unless the author is trying to highlight something, unless the author is trying to make a point. So there's 4 different women that are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1. So Mary, her role is kind of obvious because she's the mom. But then you also have Rahab, who was the prostitute in Jericho, who kind of helped the spies and did that. You have Ruth, and then you have Bathsheba. So if you think about, Ruth and Rahab, I mean, you've got a sort of a sullied reputation as far as Rahab goes in her profession. Ruth is a foreigner, right? Bathsheba kind of comes on the scene because she's in this adulterous relationship with the king. Why would you include these women in the opening chapter of the New Testament? It's like, Oh, Tamar is in there. You're right. You're right. Maybe it's not Bathsheba. Maybe I skipped that one. Yes, it's Tamar. You're right. I'm sorry. I'm turned all around. Yeah, so Tamar is also in there. We talked about her story. So why would you include these women in the opening? This is your shot to introduce Jesus to the wider world. And it's like, let's talk about some of the skeletons in the closet in his family tree. And I think the writer is trying to say something about the nature of the redemption that Jesus is bringing. It is for all people, right? It's not just for the Jewish people. It's not just for the righteous people. Rather, the unclean, the foreigner, the sinner, if you'll believe the way that Rahab did, the way that Ruth did, you're welcome in the family. And not just welcome like, hey, you can be on the outside of the community. Like, you're welcome to the heart of it. Like, you can be part of the family tree of the Messiah himself. Like, you're really in the family. So I think the reason, because technically, if you think about it, like, was Boaz's responsibility, like, should he have tried to father another son with Naomi? Or was, but she's probably past childbearing age, so does it pass on? Like, it's the intention of the law is that it passes down. But I think one of the reasons that he's mentioned here and Ruth is mentioned here, it's because people know this story. And it's like, if they mention Malon, they may be like, well, who was that again? But it talks about, again, Boaz is described as somebody who reflects that steadfast love, that kindness of God. So I think the reason that he's mentioned here is because the author's trying to make a point by including him. Doug, were you going to ask something or say something?
His concept of passing on, the brother dies, and so forth and so on. This argument is about the Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So it's not just put back in times of Ruth, it's put into early AD.
Yeah. So you mentioned, so again, the same laws that govern the people of Israel when they were in the time of Judges, they're still in application. So there's the Sadducees bring this question to Jesus because the Pharisees believed there was a resurrection of the dead and the Sadducees didn't. So the Sadducees are like, hypothetical situation, Jesus. Let's say a man's got 7 brothers. And he gets married and he dies with no kids. So she marries the second one and he dies, no kids. And on down the line, nobody has any kids. All right, Jesus, whose husband is she in heaven? And Jesus is basically like, you are completely missing the point of all of this, and I'm about to show everybody why. But just the fact that they mention that, like that law, it's still part of the society. It's still part of the culture of that time. And again, just going back to the genealogies too. So there's that idea of, these women show up because it gives us a picture into this this broader work of what does redemption mean? Who gets to be invited into this now? The other thing, if you notice, is that God often works through not the firstborn, right? So even if you read through, just the genealogy of Jesus, right? Jesus is from the line of Judah. Judah is not the firstborn in the family. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the second. I think he was the second one. So David obviously wasn't the firstborn. So there are other examples about how God's way of doing things often stands in opposition to the cultural norms of his people. Like God's work in the world critiques something about every culture. Like there's no culture. That's why I always say, like, if Jesus were going to vote in our election, like he probably, like, Jesus is not a Republican or a Democrat. Like there are some things about each of those parties that embody values of the kingdom and some things that don't. Like Jesus critiques every party. He critiques every culture. And I think that's one of these aspects, the fact that it was this culture where, well, to keep it in line, you got to work through the oldest son. God, it's like he delights in saying, like, well, I'm going to work through the second one this time. Like, just to keep you guys on your toes, just to help you know that, like, your culture is not the highest value. It's grace and mercy in me and my steadfast love. Yeah, Howard. Sure. And for the people online, Howard's going to make a few comments. And if I may not be able to repeat them all, so sorry. Mhm. Yeah, it's one of the two pillars in the temple, right? Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Oh yeah, no, those are good. Those are good. That idea of that redemption is buying something back. And often, and sometimes within the culture of the kinsman redeemer, like God wants everything that has been given away to be bought back. And if you can't buy it back yourself, there is a power greater than you with resources beyond you that is willing to sacrifice themselves to make you whole. And that's that image of redemption that carries through into the New Testament and the work that Jesus did for us. Yeah, Tracy.
One comment and get an opinion from you. So one of the things I like about Ruth is maybe a parallel also with Esther. They both had to make bold moves. Right, Esther and going to the king, but Ruth had to lift up the blanket and go lay down under his feet in the middle of the night, right? And he wakes up. So I just imagine that in my mind. In that day, in that age, in that culture, it's dark in the middle of the night, and they're out in the middle of the field, and she takes the bold move to go, put on good clothes and take that step of faith. That, of course, she's not
She does have to make some bold moves. You're right.
Yeah.
And then you said you wanted my opinion on something. That's always dangerous.
Well, I was thinking about what I appreciated is there was hadn't really correlated that one of the names related to the Proverbs 31, and how a lot of times when what we see in that day is that there's a gift of harvesting after the rebirths and getting food and things like that. That it wasn't just given to her, that she still had to work for it. Right? She still had to collect, and they took a couple of straws out of the sheaves and laid them down, but she still had to go collect it. And I think that was I wondered whether one of the things that made her attractive and known by Boaz, because he said, yeah, I know who you are, I've seen your work ethic.
Mhm.
And that's probably one of the things that makes her attractive to him that way, because she's not looking for handouts, she's looking for an opportunity.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now, just because I think when we get to the Q&A part, it's harder for that to come through.